Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to The Account with a report for day 435 of the war in Ukraine. Today I have 3 extra segments. The first is regarding the latest Russian UAV attack, again. The second is the latest on the incident involving a UAV and an explosion at the Kremlin. And the third is about President Zelensky's visit to European countries. I also have an article I want to point out. All other updates are grouped into the usual: situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, and international developments. Before we start the news though, the flashpoints along the front. Bilohorivka. A claim of Russian forces being encircled could not be confirmed. However, Ukraine did manage to recapture some territory here. Bakhmut. It seems Ukraine indeed managed to recapture the medical college in Bakhmut. However, the claimed advances near the MiG-17 monument turned out to be partially true. After Russia fell back, the area has become no man's land for now. Heavy fighting continues in the Bodanivka and Khomova direction, where Russia is still trying to break through in the direction of Chasiv Yar. Vuhledar. Russian sources came out with a curious claim. Mikilske, which lies southeast of Vuhledar, is allegedly in Ukrainian hands. Pro-Russian blogger Romanov boasted that Russian forces have managed to capture positions south of the village. This is interesting, as pretty much all maps and observers mark Mikilske as Russian occupied. And now for the article I wanted to highlight, titled Army of Hired Guns: How Russia's PMCs are becoming the main invasion force. Private armies are illegal in Russia, so naturally Moscow has been using them for decades. Now it's making them the main invasion force. The rate at which Russia creates new private military company-like units sped up after 2014, but it really took off during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as Moscow needed more manpower to throw into the battle. This article is based on an investigation by the Molfa OSCE group called Catalogue of Russian PMCs, 37 private military companies of the Russian Federation. It is extremely interesting and I highly recommend checking it out. And now for the updates on the latest Russian UAV attack. During the night, the US Embassy in Ukraine has warned of an increased threat of missile attacks, particularly on the city of Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. Only hours later, air raid warnings were issued throughout Ukraine. Serhiy Popko, head of the Kyiv City Military Administration, reported that air defense forces shot down all Russian drones and missiles that attacked Kyiv. However, falling debris caused at least some damage in the Ukrainian capital. In Odessa, the defense forces of Ukraine downed 12 out of 15 Shahed drones. Reportedly, 3 drones hit the dormitories of an educational institution in Odessa. The fire that broke out as a result of a drone hit has been extinguished. People were not injured. During the attack on Odessa, Russia launched the drones in an unusual way. The path went through the temporarily occupied territory of Kherson Oblast. The drones also were inscribed with messages like "For Moscow" and "For the Kremlin." Overall, Ukrainian defenders shot down 18 out of 24 Shahed combat drones and 1 reconnaissance UAV. Now for the updates on the curious incident involving a UAV and the explosion at the Kremlin. The press secretary of the President of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, explained why there was a 12-hour wait before Russia reported the UAV attack on the Kremlin. Allegedly, there was an operational assessment of the situation by special services. Peskov went on to accuse the US of the attack, stating that decisions on this kind of operations and terrorist attacks are made not in Kyiv, but in Washington. Finally, he expressed hope that in due time, light will be shed on where the attack on the Kremlin came from. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Ministry called on the world community to condemn the attempted attack on the Kremlin. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby called Russian claims that the US was behind the May 3rd alleged Ukrainian drone attack on the Kremlin ridiculous, and the European Union's chief diplomat Josep Borrell reacted to Russian claims, calling on the country not to use this alleged attack as an excuse to continue the escalation of the war. Following the alleged drone attack, it seems Russian authorities have started jamming GPS signals in the Russian capital. And finally, the updates on President Zelensky's visit to European countries. President Volodymyr Zelensky has officially begun his visit to the Netherlands. He met with Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Netherlands, Vera Bergkamp, and President of the Senate, Jan Anthony Bruyn, in The Hague, and expressed special gratitude to the Dutch Parliament for its support in granting Ukraine the status of an EU membership candidate. President Volodymyr Zelensky also met with Prime Minister of the Netherlands Mark Rutte and Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo and signed a joint declaration with both. The document covers the most important issues on the joint agenda: meeting Ukraine's urgent defense needs, supporting the Ukrainian formula for peace, advancing Ukraine's NATO membership, ensuring Ukraine's security, holding Russia accountable, as well as further strengthening anti-Russian sanctions and developing a mechanism for compensating losses caused by Russian aggression. During a joint press conference after, Zelensky stated that all of Ukraine is preparing for the counteroffensive, not just the military, and that Ukraine believes in its success. He also acknowledged that Ukraine will not be able to join NATO while at war with Russia. However, he demanded at least a clear signal from the alliance. Prime Minister of the Netherlands Mark Rutte, meanwhile, stated that he sees no taboo on F-16 fighter aircraft for Ukraine. President Zelensky further gave a speech before representatives of the public, political and expert circles of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and international institutions located in The Hague. During the visit to The Hague, Zelensky met with the President of the International Criminal Court, Peter Hoffmann, and the Registrar of the Court, Osvaldo Zavala Aguilera, to discuss further steps for bringing Russia to justice. Other highlights of President Zelensky's visit to the Netherlands was a meeting with King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, visiting a Dutch army base where he inspected military equipment promised to Ukraine, and honoring Ukrainian military personnel undergoing rehabilitation in the country. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. The mayor of Odessa, Hennady Trukhanov, has been taken into custody by Ukraine's Higher Anti-Corruption Court. According to investigators, in 2016, the mayor, together with other officials of the Odessa City Hall and representatives of a private company, embezzled roughly 92 million Ukrainian hryvnias from the local budget of Odessa. During the evening, an air raid warning was issued for the city of Kyiv and explosions were reported. Ukrainian Air Defense reported a drone was shot down, and Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko reported fires due to falling debris in the Solomiansky and Pechersky districts of the city. The command of the Air Force of the Armed Forces of Ukraine later clarified the situation, reporting that Ukrainian forces had to shoot down a Turkish-made Ukrainian Bayraktar drone over Kyiv after losing control over it. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. Russian troops have placed military equipment, weapons and explosives in the turbine department of Unit 4 of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, according to information obtained from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Ukraine's State Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate reported that IAEA has also received unofficial reports that Russian forces are storing similar materials in other areas of the power plant. These actions pose a serious threat to the safety of both plant personnel and nearby residents. Tamila Tasheva, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, in an interview with the news outlet Ukrinform, reported that 26 Crimean political prisoners are currently in critical health condition. She also explained that Russians who have illegally entered Crimea since the Russian occupation will be expelled from Ukraine based on individual decisions, not collectively. Explosions rocked the city of Sevastopol in Crimea around 7 p.m. Kyiv time. The city's Russian-appointed governor claimed that a drone had been shot down over the city. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. Russia currently has 7 warships on combat duty in the Black Sea, 2 of which are missile carriers with a total salvo of up to 16 cruise missiles. According to Russian news outlet Verska, Russian authorities have cancelled parades on May 9th in at least 21 cities where they took place last year, including those in occupied Crimea. Vasily Golubev, governor of Russia's Rostov Oblast, has announced a nighttime drone attack on the Novoshachtinsk oil refinery. Another drone attack was reported on the Ilsky oil refinery in Kuban, Krasnodar Krai, causing a fire. Finally, a fire broke out at an oil storage next to a concrete production plant in Stavropol Krai, Russia. Andriy Yusov, representative of Ukraine's coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war, reported at a briefing that at least 12% of Russian PoWs have no secondary education. Colonel Mykola Oshavolych, Deputy Director of the Department of Planning for the Use of the Main Directorate of the National Guard of Ukraine, stated during a briefing that Russia, in anticipation of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, is focusing its efforts on preventing panic among military personnel and fortification of the front lines. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. The European Union is discussing a new sanctions mechanism aimed at third-party countries that are not doing enough to prevent Russia from bypassing restrictions already in place. Norway has allocated 235 million euros in humanitarian aid to Ukraine and is now setting aside an additional 143 million euros in civilian support for the Ukrainian government administration. The EU's plan to supply 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine has 3 main points. First, EU member states provide additional ammunition worth 1 billion euros from their stock, with compensation from the European Peace Fund for this supply. Second, EU member states intensify the procurement of new ammunition for Ukraine, for which the European Commission allocates an additional 1 billion euros. Third, to replenish stocks and prepare for a potentially long war, the EU is strengthening and accelerating European defense industrial production. Avril Haines, US Director of National Intelligence, said that Russia is unlikely to be able to conduct a significant offensive in Ukraine this year due to a lack of ammunition and manpower, regardless of whether the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful. Additionally, she stated that according to US assessments, Russia is unlikely to launch a nuclear strike despite the Kremlin's recent saber-rattling and heavy casualties during the invasion of Ukraine. During the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation meeting, Natalia Kostenko, Deputy Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the international organizations in Vienna, declared that Russia's goal is still the capture of the entire territory of Ukraine and therefore the destruction of the nation. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting with the UK Ministry of Defense. On May 3, 2023, a fire broke out at a Russian fuel depot in Volna on the Russian mainland side of the Kerch Strait, close to the Crimean Bridge. It was initiated by a suspected drone strike. This follows a pattern of Russian fuel storage sites being damaged since the start of the year, with fuel depots in occupied Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine border regions remaining particularly vulnerable to attack. The disruption to the fuel storage and distribution network will likely force adjustments to Russia's military refueling operations to mitigate targeting. Russian adjustments could include deploying additional protection measures at fuel storage sites, as seen in Tuazbe in Russia, or relying on infrastructure in less threatened regions. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. Russia accused Ukraine of conducting a drone strike against the Kremlin on May 3rd. Russia likely staged this attack in an attempt to bring the war home to a Russian domestic audience and set conditions for a wider societal mobilization. The rapid and coherent presentation of an official Russian narrative around the strike suggests that Russia staged this incident in close proximity to the May 9th Victory Day holiday in order to frame the war as existential to its domestic audience. Some Russian nationalist mill bloggers seized on the Kremlin drone strike to call for Russian escalation in the war, despite the fact that Russia currently lacks the military capability to do so. The Kremlin may be planning to conduct other false flag operations and increase disinformation ahead of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in order to increase domestic support for the war. Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin baselessly claimed on May 3rd that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has already begun, likely in order to exploit information space anxieties and call for increased Russian military support for Wagner's Bakhmut offensive. Russian forces conducted a Shahed 131-136 drone strike against Ukraine on the night of May 2nd to 3rd. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The Russian Federation continues to wage a war of aggression. Despite the significant losses, the enemy does not give up its plans to occupy our territory. The enemy continues to disregard the laws and customs of war, uses terror tactics, strikes, and fires at both military and civilian targets. This day, at night, the Russian Federation made another massive attack on the territory of Ukraine using Iranian attack UAVs Shahed 136, 131, 18 out of 24 were destroyed by our defenders. Today, the enemy launched 6 missile strikes on the cities of Kramatorsk and Zaporizhia, carried out 66 airstrikes and launched 33 attacks from rocket salvo systems on the positions of our troops and populated areas. Unfortunately, there are deaths and injuries among the civilian population, private residential buildings, educational institutions, and other civilian infrastructure have been destroyed and damaged. The probability of launching missile and airstrikes on the entire territory of Ukraine remains high. The enemy continues to focus its main efforts on conducting offensive actions in the Liman, Bakhmut, and Marinka directions. About 50 enemy attacks were repelled. The fiercest battles continue for Bakhmut and Marinka. In the Liman direction, the enemy conducted unsuccessful offensive actions in the area of the southwestern outskirts of Spirne. In the Bakhmut direction, fighting continues in the city of Bakhmut. In addition, during the day, the enemy conducted unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of the settlements of Bodanivka and Makove. In the Marinka direction, the enemy is trying to improve the tactical position. Numerous enemy attacks in the Marinka area were repelled. Russian occupation forces continue to suffer heavy losses on the battlefield. All medical facilities in the temporarily occupied territory are full of wounded occupiers. As a result, the enemy continues to equip civilian educational institutions for medical institutions. For example, in the village of Mirne, Zaporizhia Oblast, the occupiers are converting the sports hall of the local school into a military hospital. At the same time, the Russian invaders force the teaching staff to continue the educational process with compulsory school attendance by children. And that wraps up today's report. If you're interested in any of the articles and want to read up on the details, you can find links to them in the description. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.